Good evening, everyone. This is an interesting session, and I have two of the most accomplished, complex theory experts, I would say, on this panel. So it's a privilege to actually have both of them on the same panel. I have obviously Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal with me, Principal Economic Advisor, and I have, I think, one of the most, I would say, serious believers of the complexity theory, Mr. Nassim Taleb, who has joined us live from US. Nassim, thank you so much for joining us from US. And Sanjeev, thank you so much for being part of this session. You know, today is a special day. Incidentally, today is the first anniversary of the first day of the Indian lockdown, if I can call it the Great Indian Lockdown that happened 1 year back. Sanjeev, I'll start with you. How do you reflect on that? Whatever your actions government took at that point in time, and at a very short notice, the most stringent lockdown on the planet was announced.
So you're absolutely right. It's exactly 1 year since we went into that big lockdown. And reflecting on it, I would argue that we did exactly the right thing, given the information that we had at that time. We knew that something bad had happened in China. It had spread to Italy. But beyond that, we had very little information. And the experts and virologists of that time gave us a very wide range of possible outcomes. So in that environment, the best thing we thought was to do is to do a full lockdown. Now that gave us some time to gather information, create some quarantining, testing, and other kinds of facilities. But once we had sort of better information, please notice, we also began to step-by-step opening things up through a Bayesian updating of information. So I think, given the information we had at that time, the lockdown was the right thing to do. After all, the virus may well have turned out to be just as bad as the worst case scenarios were predicting them to be. We had no way of knowing whether it would be. And we did exactly the same thing with the economic response as well, if you remember. We were under tremendous pressure to do these grand stimuluses, trillions of dollars, etc., which some other countries trotted out. But our view right in the beginning was that this was not a sprint. It was a marathon where we would have all kinds of unintended consequences and butterfly effects taking place. So in that environment, it made sense to make your way through more carefully through a sequence of medium-sized packages, which we ramped up over time. But also remember, we changed the nature of them. I mean, in the beginning, they were much more about providing a safety net. So, you know, free food, providing 100% guarantees to the MSMEs, things like that, because that's more of a safety net approach. But over time, as things were opened up, we then switched to ramping up demand. But at every stage, we again did something very different from other countries. We also put in a lot of effort into supply-side measures, and which again reflects our view that we are dealing with uncertainty. We need to continuously invest into making the system more flexible and be able to respond in this step-by-step kind of way.
Nassim, you have a very interesting view on you know, the way governments have responded to COVID. How would you rate the Indian response, the way India reacted to COVID?
I would say they did what a wise government should do, which is, in the absence of information, you don't take risks. You just make sure that you're minimizing risks. We had no idea what this disease was about. As you gain more information, then you relax the measures. You see, if I have absolutely no idea about the safety of the plane, I ground it. And then as I get more information about the plane, I will, you know, let it fly with caution. So basically, that's a precautionary principle. And I think that that measure was extremely wise. And I wish, as a matter of fact, we had such wisdom here, because in the United States, we had a severe problem. It took us an entire year before the federal government mandated PCRs at the border, which could have solved the problem and saved trillions of dollars. So basically, sometimes, even from an economic standpoint, acting quickly can help you in the long run.
I think that's a compliment for you because he was saying that, he wishes that the other governments, including US, would have responded the way India did. I'll come back to you, Sanjeev. But Nassim, what I want to know is, since the time pandemic began, everybody has been talking about, was this a black swan event? So many people have referred to your books. And so first of all, what are your comments? Was this a black swan event?
So let me explain the center of the idea of the black swan, and as explained in the book. And the Black Swan being part of the Inserto, a five-volume book, plus technical papers and academic work associated with it. So the center of the idea is the difference between what I call mediocristan and extremistan. So let me explain the difference. We are used to variables like mediocristan that vary, but not too much. So just to explain, to give you the thought experiment in the beginning of the Black Swan, if I gather 1,000 people, invite them, to New York, and there's a lot of, room in hotels in New York. Okay, so it could be a good idea. Put them on a scale and weigh them. And then I add to that scale a rare event, a consequential rare event, the largest possible person I can find on the planet. How much of the total will that person represent? Or in other words, how much will the total change? Peanuts, 0.3%, maybe 0.4%, if I have the heaviest person on our planet. Now, if I have 10,000 people, it'll be 0.04%. So basically, when you have a large sample, and you have a lot of variables, so you have it's an environment in which exceptions do not cost you much. They can happen. They do not represent a big share of the total. Now, when I move to extremistan, it's a complete different class of random variables. In extremistan, okay, things can be determined by the extreme. Let's play the same thought experiment and have the same 1,000 people. We brought them to New York randomly from the planet. And let's take their net worth, total net worth. If you're lucky, you get $200,000. Given what's going on the planet and some areas on the planet where people don't make a lot of money. So you get maybe $1 million if you're lucky in that sample, total net worth. And then you add Jeff Bezos. So the fluctuation in the price of Amazon in the last nanosecond exceed the net worth of the balance, right? So basically, he'll be 100%. Okay, and or you can take you have 4 or 5 people representing 90-some% of the total wealth. I mean, the bottom net worth. I mean, the bottom 3-4 billion have less than in total the net worth of Bezos. So you realize what's going on with concentration. So you have concentrated random variables. So I posited in the Black Swan that you have a switch towards extremistan by a lot of things, becoming even more from extremistan. Owing to what? Well, from the fact that we no longer have islands. And when you switch from an island to a continent, when you join island together, okay, you have a drop of diversity and an increase of winner-take-all effects. So in the old days, no connectivity, the Google would not have survived. Harry Potter would not have been read in Lebanon, okay, 100 years ago. So and then the same thing then, therefore, will apply to pandemics. And that was in the Black Swan. You explain how pandemics will experience that winner-take-all effects as we are increasing connectivity. We are the more connected we are, and that's of course, Sanjeev's specialty, complexity theory, the more you have to look at it from a standpoint of complexity theory or theory associated with it. There are 7 or 8 different branches, but they all will converge to the same point, that you have networks, and these networks lead to concentration, okay? So just like we had opera singers making a good living in the 1800s, okay, and then by 1995, Pavarotti and a few others were making 90% of the income. Same thing, football players in UK English. So basically, the same happened. So now let's look at the effect of connectivity on diseases. There are villages in the UK. This is 330 years, okay, but in fact, I can go to 600 years. There are villages in the UK in England, okay, that were reached by the bubonic plague between 300 and 600 years later. Just to tell you that connectivity was low. And of course, the Americas were not reached by the bubonic plague, you see, because you had the island effect. Today, we no longer have an island effect. So think about the classes of diseases we are about to have and how different they are from what we're used to traditionally. That is, that you got more from Extremistan because basically because of connectivity, you have conferences that bring people from the whole world to Las Vegas. Like you literally have conferences, and I've attended some where people come from 120 countries. And then think about it. 3 days later, you're redistributing a disease to 120 countries. So what you have, the bubonic plague at its fastest was traveling 30 miles a day. Okay, and look what's happening today. So basically, we live in a different world, more from Extremistan, with winner-take-all effects for diseases. Meanwhile, our grandmothers know that. At least my grandmother, my grandfather, my granduncle as well. They understand the point. But some people who learned a little bit of statistics immediately thinks in terms of Mediocristan. So what I call fortune cookie science or fortune cookie thinking. When this fellow, in the beginning of COVID, we were fighting this misunderstanding of the properties of multiplicative things as compared to static, non-multiplicative risks. And for example, this fellow was saying, oh, we don't shut down the country for swimming pool death. We have about 3,000 Americans die every year drowning in a swimming pool, compared to, at the time, you had only like 10 people who died of COVID. So they couldn't understand why we were more concerned by COVID than swimming pool death or fall from ladders, same order of magnitude, between 3,000 and 4,000 a year. Because if I drown in my swimming pool, my neighbor is not more likely or less likely to drown in her or his swimming pool. As a matter of fact, maybe less likely, okay? Because as Mihir observed, people become more cautious after. If I have a car accident, my neighbor is less likely to have a car accident, or equally likely, but not going to be more likely. Okay. However, if I get COVID, you bet the odds of my neighbor getting COVID has increased, and that's with multiplicative effects. And we have something called scale transformation. If the risk for an individual is low, the risk for a collective is higher because of these multiplicative effects. So you got to take these things seriously. Now, economically, we live in a world that has fragility to it increasingly. And you can see it from, and that was, I'm revising stuff I did in the Black Swan a few years later, okay, using data from 2018. And it's basically, we have the same rate of natural catastrophes as we did in the past. But the cost to GDP has increased markedly because of connectivity. Think about what's happening today in a Suez Canal. It's the same Suez Canal as it was 100 years ago or 150 years ago when de Lesseps did it. But think of traffic today, the impact on world GDP of the Suez Canal, okay, being blocked today as compared to 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. Because the more trade and the more connectivity, the more the weakest link affect us. And here, natural catastrophes have played a larger role. Now, it's what I call this large movie theater with a small door effect. So economically, this is why the impact of some things can be greater. But this is not all bad news. Now, let's look at how the ancients dealt with it. The ancients had a hugely developed mechanism of lockouts, not lockdowns, lockouts, quarantines. The minute they heard of a rumor of any disease spreading anywhere, they enforced quarantine laws. So, for example, the Ottoman Empire, you wanted to go from India to anywhere controlled by the Ottoman, you had somewhere between 7 and 18 days of quarantine, depending on what they deemed was a risk. And that lasted for hundreds of years. Between the Habsburg Empire, this is called the Lazaretto, and it was peppered. The whole border between the Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire was peppered with places like that, where they put you in for 40 days, up to 40 days. It's called a quarantine, because it was up to 40 days, where they put the travelers. So just to make sure that what little connectivity they had did not harm them as much as what happened during Justinian's plague and, of course, the Great Plague in the 1300s. So now what's happening, I conclude with the following, that something tells me that something in the East, we do not like geronticide. So I'm going to say that our grandparents, of course, would have understood the difference between COVID and drowning in a swimming pool, that something is multiplicated. They probably would not be able to articulate it, but they understood it. Likewise, they had moral values that have been absent in Northern Europe during this. So something tells me that the countries that did well through COVID would continue to do well in the future, whether economically, health-wise, or I would say ethically. So because this idea of geronticide, of killing the elderly, is absolutely absent in Eastern and Indian and Mediterranean culture. And you can see what the respect we have for the elders, whereas Europe decided to say, okay, at some point, let's do herd immunity and let the elderly die. People don't realize that the word senator means elderly in Latin, and the word sheikh in Arabic means the eldest. So your seniority in society is inverse to what it is today in traditional societies, and you keep the elders because of their wisdom, because at least they can explain to you that this policy is wrong, and we're losing that.
Sanjeev, what I want to know is the various measures that Indian government has taken, right from Atmanirbhar Bharat to PLI schemes to even the vision which we saw in the budget. And it's quite clear that the next decade is actually going to be a decisive decade for India. One is, are we conscious about this, and are we actively pursuing certain policies which can actually create post-COVID opportunities for India? And if yes, then how?
There's no question that the post-COVID world is not a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. I mean, it'll have its own technology, consumer behavior, geopolitics, all kinds of things that supply chains will change, and so on. And the key thing here is to understand that there is no way I, as a policymaker, can guess where this is all going. So what do I do? So what we have opted to do is to do this huge amount of supply-side measures. I know, many people are puzzled, why is it that in the middle of all of this, is the Indian government putting in so much effort into doing supply-side measures, deregulation, privatization, labor laws, farm law changes, and so on. We have been criticized from quite a lot. This is not the right time to do this. But in fact, we would argue this is the right time to do this. Because if you're going to go into the complete darkness, you want your factor markets to be as flexible as possible to be able to take advantage of the changes that are going to happen. And there's no way, as I said, I can predict where this will go. I can take a few bets, like through PLI schemes and so on. But overall, many of the jobs, the opportunities of the future are unknown. What do I do as a policymaker? Well, I can put in maybe some physical infrastructure, which is likely still to be relevant, airports and things like that. I don't think airports are just about going to go obsolete. They could, but I think they'll be still relevant. So I can invest in airports. I can invest in power production and renewables and things like that, maybe. So we are, by the way, putting in huge amount of effort, as you know, into physical infrastructure. We can put in some resources into health. That's clearly something that's important, irrespective of the pandemic. But by and large, what we need to do is to open things up so that there can be an adjustment to the new environment, taking advantage of natural creative destruction, so to speak. And of course, leveraging the animal spirits of the private sector. So if you listen to what, for example, the Honorable Prime Minister has been saying recently, we've got to be able to support wealth creation and innovators and risk takers. And of course, the frustration then consequently also on those things that get in the way, including bureaucracy, which tends to be, try and slow this readjustment. So I think the ideas that you just heard from Nassim are very much part of the way we think about very similar lines of thought. Not surprisingly, we are both complexity theory enthusiasts. So, but it is a lot about flexibility, dealing with uncertainty, randomness, and unpredictable spread of effect through networks. All of this is very much a part of our thinking process.
Right. Nassim, last year when you visited India for India Economic Conclave, I remember one of your comments that probably countries like India need to create a mechanism where it is easy for companies to fail. It is easy for entrepreneurs to fail because then you encourage them to take risks without suffering that kind of heavy, I would say, social and financial costs. Now in the post-COVID scenario, and like you rightly said, that a lot of things are going to change permanently. What is your view?
People are afraid of failure. So if you take the most active sector, in the most active country in the world, America has the highest bankruptcy rate in the world. And in America, the sector with the highest bankruptcy rate is technology. And it's the most vibrant one. So now, this requires a complete different way of thinking. So in Europe, is plagued by, and of course India as well, Europe is plagued by people who want to help the economy by becoming civil servants. When you're a good student, failing is not an option. But in real life, it's completely different. So you have to encourage people to fail. And if they want to help the planet, go start a business. Start a business. You're helping the planet a lot more because we need people with the guts to fail. You need to make it socially acceptable.
Right. I think the key takeaway from this session is that we have to be prepared. The next catastrophe will come, if not pandemic, then something else. But we need to be ready for that and keep working towards probably a better future. At least in Indian context, this decade matters the most to us. Nassim, thank you so much for joining us on this session.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Sanjeev, thank you. And hope to see you soon in person, Nassim. Thank you so much.
Thanks.